Welcome to Virtual Wednesdays. My name is Francesca D'Alessio, and I'm so glad you could join us tonight. Tonight, we are so excited to host Catherine Wagner. For over 30 years, Bay Area artist Catherine Wagner has observed the built environment as a metaphor for how we construct our cultural identities. Tonight, we present Catherine Wagner in conversation with Janna Keegan, the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and Programming here at the Fine Arts Museums. Janna's first job out of college was working with Catherine Wagner's studios. Please give a warm welcome to Janna Keegan and Catherine Wagner.
Thanks, Fran. Over the course of her career, Catherine Wagner has been observing the built environment as a metaphor for how we construct our cultural identities. In 2001, Ms. Wagner was named one of Time Magazine's Fine Arts Innovators of the Year. Her work is represented in major collections such as the de Young Museum, LACMA, SFMoMA, the Whitney Museum, and MoMA in New York. She has examined institutions as various as art museums, science labs, the home, and Disneyland. Many of Ms. Wagner's projects have focused on the recontextualization of various archives, resulting in projects such as Reclassifying History, a narrative history of the light bulb, reparations, and Rome works. Ms. Wagner's process involves the investigation of what art critic David Benetti calls, quote, the systems people create, our love of order, our ambition to shape the world, the value we place on knowledge, and the tokens we display to express ourselves, end quote. Catherine Wagner has been an active international artist, working photographically, as well as with site-specific art, lecturing extensively at museums and universities for over 30 years. Wagner is represented by Jessica Silverman Gallery in San Francisco and Gallery Lusati in Santa Monica. She has received many major awards, including the Rome Prize in 2014, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an NEA Fellowship, and the Art Adia Award. Ms. Wagner has had one-person exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, LACMA, the de Young, Museo Morandi, and the Museum of Modern Art in Bologna. Catherine Wagner has been on the faculty of Mills College for over 30 years. She is the inaugural Nancy Cook Endowed Chair in the Arts and Visual Culture Department. Catherine Wagner also holds the unique distinction of being one of the last artists exhibited in the old de Young building, which closed to the public on December 31st, 2000, and one of the first artists to exhibit in the new de Young building, which opened in 2005. So thank you so much for joining us today, Catherine. I was hoping you could start by reviewing the history of exhibiting with the de Young, starting with museum pieces. Bay Area artists consider the de Young, which was guest curated by Glenn Helfland. This is one of the last exhibitions in the old de Young building. How did you come to be involved in it, and what was your initial research process like?
Thank you, Janna. It is very interesting to me, and it was a real fluke. Glenn Helfand, who's an art critic and curator, was asked by then Chief Curator Steve Nash in the old de Young to put together an exhibition in anticipation of the museum closing, knowing that there would be the new museum with Herzog and Meuron, the architects. And there had clearly been a decision that the de Young was going to begin to focus on contemporary art. So Glenn's exhibition, Bay Area Artists Envision the de Young, was the closing exhibition for the old de Young Museum. He invited, I think, between 8 and 10 different artists, and we were all asked to consider what area, what physical or conceptual area of the museum would we like to explore. And I started immediately thinking about how does a museum function? I started thinking about the notion of the archive, the notion of conservation, what gets recorded, who says what is deemed worthy of collecting. So I started thinking of all these kind of pragmatic structural frameworks of the museum. And I found myself doing a deep dive into the archives of the de Young in terms of the collection and in terms of the physical plant of how the museum functions. How does an exhibition get made? And I found myself in one of the Preparators Labs or studios where they were making various armatures for three-dimensional objects of this ship. And you'll see the image here. And this was actually a shelf in the museum, in the conservation lab. And there are these very kind of three-dimensional metal armatures, if you will, and each one had a label. And that label had a real didactic attached to it in terms of like, what object was this armature made for? And that armature was for a pragmatic reason to get that object to be safe and stand up of wherever it was going to be exhibited. So I started thinking of these shelves that were in the Preparators Lab as these ships. They started looking like these kind of 19th century sailing vessels. And I deinstalled them from the Preparators Lab and reinstalled them in this kind of makeshift studio in the bowels of the old de Young Museum. And I hung these shelves with a strong translucent fishing wire so that they were suspended. And then I used strobe light to illuminate them in this dark background, creating this very kind of like this kind of sea landscape, if you will, that actually kind of embodies so much of the history of the de Young.
Yeah, this here is ship 2, which is actually in the museum's collection. And resembling a frigate, it visually ties the history of the de Young specifically, and museums generally, with colonialism. As many people know, museums grew out of the idea of Wunderkammers, which were cabinets of curiosities, in which Europeans could amass objects collected from around the globe. Could you discuss how your work with the Registrar Ledgers reflects the colonial practices in creating taxonomies? Next slide.
Another area that I was really quite interested in photographing were, I found in this old office library a series of boxes, and when I opened them, it was the historical Registrar's Ledgers from when the museum first opened. And this is obviously pre-computer, and everything that the museum collected was handwritten in this beautiful cursive text and annotated with the cost of the object, who donated the object, what collection, what area of the collection that object would go to. And so it was really this kind of tangible written history of what was deemed worthy for collection. And it was, an encyclopedic collection, and there could be anything from, a Van Gogh painting to an early stuffed pigeon that went into, the collection of American decorative arts. So it was disparate, and it was eclectic, and it really became this kind of visceral history of recording. And now we're really thinking about, we're very much thinking about the ideas of kind of decolonizing museums. And so unbeknownst to me in 1999, when I was working on this project, I was already very much thinking about, the structure of the museum, who deems what worthy, what decisions get made. Now, one thing I want to bring up is that the Registrar's Ledgers were actually installed, 12 pages of them, photographed with an 8x10 view camera. So they were so hypnotically realistic, but they were juxtaposed with 12 pages of the marbled end papers, which has this beautiful kind of, 18th century marbled patterning, if you will. So the formal beauty of the marbled end papers brought the viewer in closer, and then actually you were able to read very accurately these 12 pages that were just selected very at random.
As you mentioned, this work is so prescient of our contemporary moment. But back then, and when you were working on reclassifying history with the de Young in 2005, was there also something in the contemporary zeitgeist that made you think about recontextualizing history?
I've recently done a book called Place, History, and the Archive. And those are three areas that, as an artist, that I have really pulled apart and excavated for over 40 years. I'm probably the foundation of what my work is built on is really about how knowledge gets transferred. So to think about the archive and to think about history and to think about place came very naturally to me then as somebody who's very interested in the life of the mind and history in particular. Now, there's so many revisionist art historical texts being written, and appropriately so, because I was thinking many years ago, actually, when I was working on reclassifying history for the de Young exhibition, I was thinking about the person who writes these texts. That publication is a reflection not of history, but it's a reflection of that historian and the way that he or she decided how that figure resides in history. So I was quite interested in kind of pulling that apart and thinking about the ways in which that history's been told, and wanting as an artist to challenge those histories.
And if we could switch to the next slide, I'm hoping that you could tie that thought specifically to why you decided to work with the statue of Columbus.
So I was given a temporary studio space down near the San Francisco airport in a warehouse where the collection was being stored during the construction of the new de Young Museum. And I had access to photograph, and I had made a very kind of in situ large scale studio with a 50-foot black backdrop, so that I could start creating these, what I call fictive histories. And one of the very first pieces that I asked one of the conservators to unwrap from the collection was this very highly representational figure, marble figure of a young man. And I said, well, who's this? And they said, that's Christopher Columbus, imaged, carved as a young man. And I thought, oh my God, Christopher Columbus I've never seen Christopher Columbus imaged as a young man. He's always been kind of presented as this powerful, noble explorer who founded America. Where in fact, now 20 years later, there's been enough kind of rethinking and revisionist history that we now know Christopher Columbus as somebody who got lost on his way to India, landed in America, and really kind of desecrated the indigenous tribes that were living here. So there's such a conflicted history about Christopher Columbus, and I thought, how perfect for this idea that I wanted to talk about for this show, which I was at that time already calling reclassifying history. But more importantly, as an artist, as they were unwrapping this figure, they were removing these layers of Tyvek and various kind of archival fabrics. And when they came to the storage crate or the shipping crate, they said, we can go ahead and take the Christopher Columbus statue outside of the crate. I said, no. I said, it was just so serendipitous that crate served as a reframing device. And that reframing device allowed for like this reframing of gestures of the portrait. And I knew that if I photographed this sculpture from all four sides, kind of north, east, southwest, and then digitally stitch those together, it resides as kind of a very large scale photograph, 10 feet long by I think 6 feet high. And it's entitled Four Perspectives on Christopher Columbus. So in many ways, it's this very kind of subversive deconstruction of the ways in which that Christopher Columbus has been taught.
If we could go to the next slide, you of course create a fictive history with Columbus and another pair of statues in the museum. I was hoping you could talk about why, among all the statues in our collection, you decided to pair young Columbus with Penelope and Delilah.
So I had license to do what I wanted, and I'm a storyteller by nature. That's part of what I do with my own artwork. And I thought, what happens if we take these three known figures from history and create a completely fictive history? So I take Christopher Columbus, imaged as a young man. I move Penelope from the Odyssey, and she's strapped down to this pallet. And then there's Delilah from the Bible. there's no reason why these three figures would ever be together in any kind of history. So in creating this fictive history, I'm creating this new myth, and hopefully it was going to be asking people to rethink about how history's been told to them. And in creating this complete, fictive tableau, it challenges the ways in which history's been told. And I used a very deliberate strategy formally in that I made these photographs so hypnotically beautiful that whether or not you were interested in history, you were seduced by the beauty of these images. And so the more you had to spend time with them, hopefully the viewer had to start wrestling with kind of the conceptual underpinnings of the image.
I think it's perhaps easier to see how creating fictive history works when you're working with representational imagery. But if we can go to the next slide, you've also done this with the chairs in the collection. So I was hoping you could speak a bit about how fictive histories inform these works.
So I knew that for the opening of the new De Young, I knew they were going to be doing in the American Decorative Arts kind of a very kind of staid chronology on the history of the chair. And as you know, many of my photographs, or if you've seen many of my photographs, they don't have the specificity of a person, but I'm always commenting about, in many ways, I see almost all of my photographs as being portraits or at least cultural portraits. So since I knew that there was going to be this chronology of laying out the chair, I thought, what happens if I create this collision? And this collision, because chairs, we often speak about chairs with a very anthropomorphic language. Like we talk about the arms of a chair, the seat of a chair, the back of a chair, the legs of a chair. We're making all these body politic references. And when you think about architecture and you think about culture, architecture has always been a mirror of culturally what's going on at that time. So I started taking these like this is a Frank Lloyd Wright chair. And if you think about Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, he's very much one of the proponents of, less is more. And I pair that next to this Victorian Belter chair. They're in opposition to each other culturally. The notion of the decorative in the Victorian era, the notion of kind of the more minimalist, less is more from Frank Lloyd Wright. So it's a very simple maneuver, if you will, but it's conceptually rich in terms of like talking about kind of cultural collisions.
And in regards to cultural collisions, next slide, I remember you told me a story about how our education department reached out to you to talk to you about how important this work, Reclassifying History 7, was in creating dialogues with school groups.
So apparently there were a lot, these two chairs, I again, talking about collisions, I took these Charles and Ray Ames chairs that is in the collection of the De Young, and I basically had them in confrontation with each other. And so here's this dark brown Ames chair looking at this maple Ames chair as if they are in conversation. And apparently a lot of high school groups and younger groups would huddle around this photograph and talk about race and issues of race, and using this photograph metaphorically to have that discussion. And I was really delighted with that. And now, Janna has been talking to me about this work being prescient. And I think in some ways, in 2005, the work had actually, it was conceived of in 2005, but I think in many ways, it probably has a more kind of cultural zeitgeist right now than it did in 2005.
Yeah, and if we could zoom back or zoom out a bit to look at the practice of creating fictive histories in your practice at large. I know after this exhibition, you were awarded the Prix de Rome. Could you talk a bit about the creation of fictive histories that informed the photographs in Rome works?
So in 2013 or 2012, I was nominated for the Prix de Rome prize, and I didn't think I could leave the country for a year and work in Rome. And somebody said, well, you were nominated, so you should at least go through the application process because it takes a couple of years to get one of these. And I thought, the more I thought about it, I thought, wow, I felt that there was so much more work to do when I finished the exhibition Reclassifying History for the Dion. And I thought about Rome as being the city, the seat of this kind of Western canonical history. And I thought, wow, that actually could be that place where I pick up the linkage from reclassifying history and continue that idea in Rome. So I did receive the prize that year and moved in 2013 to Rome for a year and created a body of work entitled Rome Works, which is really an extension of reclassifying history. And this image that you see here, Artemis Diana, she's written about as the woman who could never be tied down, or the hunter, a very powerful woman. And I found myself going to conservation labs because I was very interested in the ways in which, when a piece of artwork is being restored or is being conserved, the meaning of that piece looks very different because of its whatever is happening that in its need to be restored or conserved. So here we see Artemis Diana in this kind of place of transition where she's being trussed up in this kind of electric blue armature, 20th century armature, and she's being trussed up. And I knew when I made this photograph that it was absolutely tied to the continuing sentence or the continuing paragraph from the work I did in reclassifying history.
And next slide. The following work you did is an exploration of bust typologies that you found in Rome. I was wondering if you could talk about why it's important to question these typologies and the definitions that we create in art history.
One of the things that happened, because I had access to so many collections as a Rome Prize Fellow, I was really struck by how many busts and how many historical figures and the ways in which that the curatorial teams wrote the didactics about all of these busts. And there was I was really thinking about material culture. And I was thinking, what happens if we take the face away, the portrait goes away, so we're just left with this kind of this chest image of the body and the materiality of the marble and all the ways in which that kind of sensual carving of marble. But more importantly, as I was looking through, for instance, in the Capitolini Museum, the Philosopher's Hall. In the Philosopher's Hall, I took away all the wall didactics. So there were no wall didactics. So that was stripped of kind of written information. And in doing so, I became very aware that there were maybe one or two at the most women represented in Philosopher's Hall. But in the next room, the Emperor's Hall, there starts being a larger percentage of women. But when I was looking at how the men were written about on the wall didactics, you would see that it was like Demosthenes, Aristotle. They were remembered by who they were in history. But when you started looking at the women's busts, they said things like ritratto femminile, which means portrait of a woman. And almost all of them were only remembered by gender and not by who they are and what their contributions were in history. So I made these two typologies, these 6-part typologies, 6 of the men and 6 of the women. And in one of the 6 of the women's busts, there's the name Faustina Minore. But in the other 6, it just references ritratto femminile, the portrait of a woman. Whereas in the 6 busts of the men, they're all absolutely remembered for who they are. So I thought that was a really powerful, another powerful kind of slice and fragment of what else has been left out of history. And this piece, the bust typologies female, is going into a new show by Apsara Dickinzio called New Time, Art and Feminisms in the 21st Century. And that opens at the Berkeley Art Museum, I think in August or September 2021. So it really allowed me this notion of thinking about history and how history's been told. I was kind of like the provocateur to challenge those histories and see those collisions. And again, all of this work is built on this kind of platform of like how knowledge gets transferred.
To me, the work that really exemplifies this series is the next slide, where you have the image of Constantine. So I was hoping you could talk about how removing these works from their normal museum context, or stripping away the patina of a mythology, or in this case of Constantine, its literal deconstruction, can help the viewer to question the notion of historical veracity.
On Fridays, the Rome Prize Fellows always took a field trip with an archaeologist and a historian to talk about various works and to really learn about the city of Rome. And when we went to see the Constantine fragments, we weren't allowed to see it because they were under that whole area of where the Constantine fragments reside was under conservation. And conservation's, a very serious art form in Italy, as it should be. So we weren't allowed to see it. And I spoke to various administrators, and I said, I'm incredibly interested in that kind of that fluid space of when an artwork is being conserved, because it's not presented in the way that it was intended to be presented, but it's that kind of interstitial moment of space where we're looking at something that it's not meant to be seen like that. Anyhow, after a long period of time, I did have access to photographing this, and there was this scaffolding that kind of intersected and bifurcated, and these various layers of Tyvek covering all these things. So I unwrapped it to a certain degree where I felt that the scaffolding, the covering, all of it really kind of, it was this kind of, it served it on a platform of really challenging like that canonical Western history, because of all the kind of cancellations, if you will, from the crates to conserve it during its process of restoration.
I think that viewing a sculpture that we would normally see as such a colossus in this state reminds us that history is in fact constructed and open to questioning. That is actually the end of our time, but thank you so much for joining us and talking a bit about how the exhibitions at the De Young have played into your larger practice in general. Back to Fran.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Janna. That was awesome. I am so excited to announce that our museums are now open. Calder Picasso is now on view at the De Young Museum. We recommend booking your tickets in advance online at tickets.famsf.org. It is a wonderful show. Please come see it. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you next week.